It's not about, did you spend 80 hours practicing on lead code? It's really about what are the things that we're going to do day to day at Sift, and can you do those things? My big takeaway from SpaceX was that you learn quickly, and then you can reincorporate those learnings and adapt and ship new things.
Almost every headline you have ever read about layers in an organization is about the need to remove them. If you have too many layers, it slows down decisions and it means a company can't move forward. And though I generally agree with this, there can be too many leaders and too many layers. I also think you can have too few, right? Well, according to our guest today, you can have too few leaders. And he says that because he has experienced it himself. Austin Spiegel started his career as a software engineer at SpaceX before moving on to Riot Games, and then in 2022 co-founding Sift, a company trying to provide better tools for gathering and analyzing hardware telemetry. This was a fantastic discussion. We touch on some of his early lessons as a new engineering leader when he was at SpaceX, why a company can actually be too flat and without enough leaders, it can slow down decisions, the importance of culture to inspire people, and how to interview for talent in a way that doesn't rely on pedigree. It was absolutely fantastic talking with Austin. Before we get into that discussion, I do want to remind you that if you are listening to the show and realize that the leaders in your organization need more support, Built, my company, and the reason this show exists, is here to help. At Built, we are on a mission to train the next generation of hard tech leaders to build teams capable of solving the world's hardest problems. Just send an email to hello@builtleaders.com and we will see if we can help. With that shameless plug out of the way, let's get into the discussion with Austin Spiegel. So Austin, here's where I would love to start. What is telemetry and why is it so bad?
Yeah, so telemetry is typically sensor data that is coming from physical sensors or the flight computer on a vehicle. So think a rocket or a spacecraft or a Dragon capsule, which is a spacecraft. And it could also be, software metrics as well. Telemetry is actually a commonly used term across many industries. So in the world of software development, we capture telemetry on our software, but specifically with vehicles, you're typically referring to, or hardware, you're typically referring to sensor data. And the way that we look at it is it's a value and a timestamp. So it could be the pressure at a specific time, or it could be, the CPU measurement at a specific time. Why is it so bad? Good question. This problem has largely been solved for software, right? So maybe you or your listeners have heard about companies like Datadog or Honeycomb. You've heard about tools like InfluxDB and Prometheus. These are all databases or full stack observability platforms for capturing telemetry, analyzing and visualizing it for software use cases. They really serve the software engineers. And I think, one of the reasons those tools have been so deeply developed is because software engineers love to solve problems for themselves. They know the problem, they understand it,
sure,
so it's
that
easy,
makes sense.
right? Whereas hardware, especially, post 90s when there was a great consolidation in the defense industry, hardware has kind of been underserved by software, and it's not really well understood until I'd say the last 5 to 10 years. So that's why, there really hasn't been a modern hardware observability platform, because no one really knew, or not many people knew, that it was a really big problem. And it's really only become apparent with, I think, the massive explosion of kind of startups that have started to build hardware, and they need a lot of these tools that companies that had a lot of resources like SpaceX or even, Lockheed Martins of the world could build themselves. So I think that's, primarily why it's really not in a good spot right now.
It's really interesting because we're having this discussion the week after the Super Bowl, and there was actually a brief moment in the Super Bowl that really reminds me of our conversation here, because they were talking about how all NFL footballs now have a little position sensor in them. And I think it takes position data like 6 times a second or something like that, because it needs to be really, really small and not get in the way of anything. And they were asking the question of why don't they use that? Why do they still have the little guys run out there with the flags and figure out where it is? And they said, well, because with only 6 times a second, the ball can move like 10 feet in between those pings. Yeah. And if you miss one, then it's 20 feet. And it's like a super simplistic example of where telemetry can go wrong. Because when you drop things, when you don't have that data, the things that are happening at the pressures and the temperatures and the speeds in a rocket, I'm sure tenths of a second, hundredths of a second you can miss whole things. I remember watching the investigation of what the Amos 6, the Falcon 9. Yeah.
Well, there was CRS-7, and then Amos 6 was when it blew up on the pad.
It was on the pad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the pad, I think that whole anomaly happened in something like 12 hundredths of a second or so, so it was just like such a small. And so that's really why how valuable this data is. So how is Sift going to change that? What are you trying to do? How are you going about tackling this problem?
Yeah. I'm actually so glad you brought up that example as well, because it reminded me, there's also a distinct kind of difference between collecting telemetry for software engineering use cases and collecting telemetry for hardware engineering use cases. And that's why we decided to build Sift, right? We thought, actually, when we were founding Sift, I thought companies would be using Datadog. And it turns out that Datadog doesn't solve the solution. And one of the reasons it doesn't solve the solution is because it can't, it's too expensive to, and it can't store really high fidelity, high resolution, high frequency telemetry like you're describing, right? And typically in the software world, actually, when you're sampling telemetry from software, you're typically looking at an aggregate. So you'd say, well, actually, I only want to know, what the P99 request latency is. I don't necessarily need to go look at the request latency for every request, for thousands of requests I receive per second. But in the world of software, or hardware, like you're describing, right? When another good example is when Dragon 1, I think it was Demo 1, blew up on the pad. All of that happens so quickly. And all of those sensors are sampling, 1,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz. So you need to be able to dive in and understand what happened in these nanoseconds, right? So how are we solving that at Sift? Well, our experience with SpaceX was that this was a big data problem.
Every single one.
Starlink creates, I'm sure much more now, but back in 2020, it was like tens of terabytes of telemetry per day. And you needed a solution where you could store all of that telemetry. We also knew that most of that telemetry is never looked at. And then if it is looked at, it's typically looked at, hours after the event, and then it may never be looked at again. So when we broke down that problem, and we knew we also wanted to build a cloud solution because we needed really large volumes, we needed to be able to store really large volumes of data. We realized that what we needed was essentially like a data lake for storing large volumes of data for a long period of time, and then we needed a cache on top of that for real-time data. And then so that helps us solve the kind of data problem. And then really the other part of it is kind of the application layer that's purpose-built for hardware engineering use cases. So how does a hardware engineer want to visualize telemetry? How does a hardware engineer want to analyze telemetry? And then we built, this data review platform that was inspired by a lot of the data review tools that my co-founder Karthik, who worked on Dragonflight software, used. So this is, a workflow that is really common, actually. If you talk to other hardware engineers, they're probably familiar with data review. But this is not a workflow that's common in the software engineering world. So we've built this application that enables customers to do that.
Yeah, I do. It is interesting how, kind of as you said before, there seems to be this big lagging gap in hardware focused software, like to enable the testing, to enable the operations. And so much of that inside of SpaceX that led them to, build so much of it themselves. And there's just been this whole spiel of all these people who have then left and gone on to try to build companies to build that software themselves that they can then sell to everybody else who's kind of trying to follow in the wake of SpaceX, which is really pretty awesome.
I always say that I think the real secret sauce, I mean, there's a lot of incredible aspects of SpaceX, but some of the secret sauce is that, there's several hundred software engineers that are building
Yeah.
the entire software stack to design, manufacture, launch, reusable rockets and thousands of low Earth orbit satellites. Um, and that's what enabled SpaceX to get ahead, right? Like
Yes.
no one had reused a rocket before.
Yeah.
So you weren't going to go buy some software that helped you reuse a rocket.
Yeah.
You needed to build the software that enabled reusing the rocket.
Yeah, speaking, even though I'm on more like the HR side, after I left SpaceX, I went to a company where I got to work directly with software engineers to build our own talent development tool to our like review system. We built it, and just having access to top quality software engineers to build. I mean, in 3 months, we built something that we probably could have paid, $50,000 a year or $100,000 a year. That would have just been, like orders of magnitude worse to get kind of like a
Right.
SaaS product. And so it was just
Right.
so incredible. I want to
Yeah.
shift us because the focus of our conversation today is meant to be about leadership and kind of the things that you learned about leadership. There's a number of specific things I want to dive into. You recently reposted some like an interview with Lava Lab there were a couple of key points that I want to go into, but I would love to start kind of with your initial experiences becoming a people leader. I think that was at SpaceX. What was
Yes.
that? What was that first jump? I feel like that's one of the hardest leaps to make, going from engineer, individual technical contributor to people manager for the first time. What was that like? What was that experience like for you?
Great question. So I went into people management when I was quite early in my career.
Yeah.
So at that point, I think I'd only been at SpaceX for 2.5 to 3 years. And then I was an intern prior to that. So it definitely, in hindsight, sometimes I wonder if it was too early. But at that time, SpaceX, we were in a very flat organization.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that we needed more leaders and managers in order to, move more quickly because the decisions were, being, I think, centralized to too many people or to too few people. So I decided that, I was threw my hat in the ring. I felt like I was capable of it. There were things that I saw that I wanted to improve, and I stepped into the role to do that. And I think one of the nice things about doing it at SpaceX was that you were expected to still be, almost a full-time individual contributor
Yeah.
on top of being a lead engineer. So I got to continue to grow my technical skill set while also learning how to, manage a team and lead a team.
I got to go back a second because you said something that I think is rarely said, in that you thought the team originally was a little too flat, that there was too
Yeah.
little leadership, and that was leading to slower decisions. Usually you hear the reverse, where it's just like, oh, we got all these layers and we got to remove them and everything. What makes you say that it was like that? How do you think back on that and be like, oh, the cause of this slowness or the cause of these problems is the fact that it was too flat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think perhaps the reason I say that is because it's a problem that I'm experiencing right
Great.
now as our
Okay.
team has grown very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that when you have a very flat organization, you have fewer people that are looked to maybe
Mhm.
to make decisions or are relied on to make decisions.
Yeah.
And there's not a very clear, there's not as much clear accountability or clear delegation of tasks. And then you're kind of waiting on those people to make those decisions, right? So I think that's kind of what that comes from, is like then there becomes bottlenecks in decision making.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough people who, have clearly been identified as kind of the people that we need to go to.
Yeah.
But I want to be clear too. I think leadership comes in many forms, and there's people leadership and there's technical leadership.
Yeah.
And a lot of those decisions can be driven through technical leaders. That's also something that was changing at SpaceX at the time. So when I joined SpaceX, we didn't have levels. Everyone was a software engineer.
Yep.
And then I was there during the transition to leveling, and I think that really changed the dynamics of the organization.
Yeah, I can see that. And then it can really, I think that's a big move that's really positive in a lot of organizations, when there's kind of those like dual track structures where you don't have to become a people manager in order to continue moving forward in your career. And yeah, it's a great way to push off some of those more technical decisions to the non-people managers. It can be a great way to do that. That makes a lot of sense. Any particular early lessons that you remember or early challenges that you remember when you became a people leader for the first time that you had to kind of like a mindset change or a new thing that you had to learn? What was the sticking point for you?
The biggest challenge, honestly, was that we were a matrixed organization. So all of my direct reports were in different teams.
Oh,
So we did this squad model basically where the teams were kind of reorged every 60 days. And, this is a very SpaceX process to basically keep people focused on the highest priority things and ensure the right people are working on those tasks. It was really challenging as a manager because if you have 5 to 8 direct reports, now you have to also keep tab on, 5 to 8 different projects and how your direct report is performing within that project.
yeah.
So I think that was very challenging for me, but I think it also really makes it improved the pace of my learning as a manager because I had to develop systems for, gathering feedback, providing people with feedback, coaching when I wasn't directly involved.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's actually, if you're already, maybe you're the de facto lead of a team and then you become the team's manager, that's not a huge transition. There's also the benefit of like, you've probably worked on the software that team is building. So you can provide guidance on that as well, right? Into now this kind of model where you may have never worked on the thing that your direct report is currently working on. But how do you still make yourself useful to them?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of management at that level is just connecting the dots, right? So bringing the necessary context that you have to your direct reports, and then also gathering context about their work so that you can ensure that they're doing well and that they're getting everything that they need from their teammates.
I love how you said that, both the context and then specifically the gathering the context, because I think that is one thing that a lot of new leaders struggle with is they think because when you're a pure technical contributor, it's like that's what you're contributing. Like your skill in this engineering or for this thing is what your contribution is. And so then you become a manager. And as you say, like, if I don't have that expertise, how do I bring value? And it is so often kind of your slightly higher purview of being able to like talk to different people or get different information feeds that you can then distill down and bring to them is just can be it's your ability to gather information and resources and provide it to them, which is so critical.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
When you left SpaceX, you went to Riot Games. And what was anything in particular stand out to you in changing organizations? Was it a very similar organization? Was it a very similar culture? Or was it like just from like a thinking about as a manager, did you have to like take a shift on like, oh, being a manager now means this in this new organization? Was there anything like that?
It was wildly different.
Okay.
There's actually a lot. Yeah, which, partially was something that I was looking for, I think. Because I had started my career at SpaceX. I worked there for 5.5 years, including my internship. And I felt that in order to continue growing as a leader, which is what I wanted to do, I wanted to stay in leadership. I wanted to stay in management. I needed to see a different management and leadership culture.
Yeah.
And I think something that attracted me to Riot was one was that it was a lot of software engineers, and software at SpaceX is even though it's still a really critical part of the business, it's kind of plays second to the hardware side of the company. And I liked that Riot was, I think, very explicit about what its company values were, and I felt that these values were really incorporated into all aspects of working at Riot. So everything from the interview process to performance reviews to the all hands, this is where the values were incorporated. And then that meant that people actually exemplified the values. Whereas I think SpaceX has values, they're just implicit, right?
Yeah.
And SpaceX is such a unique company because it has this crazy goal of going to Mars, and people sign up because they're so motivated by that. And frankly, there's just not that many companies that where that is one, a realistic goal that can actually be achieved.
Yeah.
And they have that goal that is so inspiring, right?
Yeah.
So you need to find other ways then to motivate people and to deliver a great product. And I think that was something that I wanted to go see at Riot. So that's kind of why I joined Riot. I think the things that were really different from a management perspective is it was not as a very non-technical role. So
Okay.
my team, at SpaceX, I was a lead engineer. We didn't have product managers. We didn't have project managers. Engineers were full stack, everything from product to software to infrastructure. At Riot, my team was myself. I was the engineering manager. I had a tech lead. I had a delivery lead, and I had a product manager. So that's basically four people on in the kind of leadership of a 10 to 12 person engineering team. And given some of those people were also have responsibilities on other teams, so they weren't full-time dedicated. But, that was a huge adjustment. In some ways, great, because now I had more support. In other ways, as someone who I think what I learned at SpaceX was I enjoyed having control and doing many things and wearing many hats, it was more challenging. And then I'd say my biggest growth was that I got to become a hiring manager. And that was a really great lesson. So at SpaceX, at least when I was there, lead engineers were not hiring managers. We did interviews, but we weren't involved in the decision process.
Sure.
And I think becoming a hiring manager, realizing how crucial hiring is when you have open headcount, I think that's probably the most important, highest priority for a manager is to fill your headcount. That was a huge lesson. I think that has been incredibly informative in building a startup where, we've raised capital. Now we have to deploy that capital, and our biggest expense is our people. So we have to not only hire quickly, but we need to hire great people, and we need to design an interview process and figure out how to filter people out and so on and so forth. So, this was like a really big lesson, and I'm really glad that I had that opportunity at Riot.
Well, that's a perfect way to segue into some of the quotes from Lava Lab. One of the things that you said was pedigree does not equal talent. The best builders are scrappy and come from unexpected places. So you talk about at Sift, you're building this hiring program. How do you do that? Because I do think I have a lot of qualms with a lot of companies, because I do feel like so many organizations, because they don't really know what they need, they kind of outsource the deciding process to other people, whether it be other companies or universities. And they say, well, they worked at this company, so they must be good. Or they went to school here, so they must be good. And really what you're doing there is you're not figuring out how to decide what is good. And so it sounds like you're going straight at that problem. What are some of the things that you've seen work? How do you think about identifying that best talent if it's coming from unexpected places?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. And I think, my mind, I will say, evolves on this constantly.
I'm
because, there will always be people that surprise you and buck the trend. I will say what we've tried to do since day one here at Sift is make our interviews very practical. So it's not about, can you solve this algorithm that you may never use again? And it's not about, did you spend 80 hours practicing on lead code so that, you could solve some dynamic programming question. It's really about what are the things that we're going to do day to day at Sift, and can you do those things?
Yeah.
And how do you work with our team in doing those things? How do you collaborate, right? So the interview is as much about showing your work, right, which is what we all did in school, as it is about getting to the right answer at the end. It's actually about how did you approach the problem. So our interview process is, of course, we have a technical phone screen. And then on the onsite, we do a presentation. So actually, this is something that we did at SpaceX. And I think, engineers will think, well, why are we doing a presentation? But a presentation is a really great opportunity for the candidate to put their best foot forward and to present on something that they're really knowledgeable about.
Yeah.
So, the best candidates will just take advantage of that, and they'll talk deeply about a technical subject or a project that they've solved before. They'll be able to answer all of our questions and go deep on it. So there's really no way to, oh, you didn't know the answer, so on and so forth. Then, of course, we do like a system design interview, which is really based on what we're doing here at Sift. And then we do another coding problem, which is really just about kind of like fundamentals. It's actually not about algorithms at all, but more about kind of like fundamental software engineering concepts. And then we do our values interview, and then the values interview, ties into kind of all of the company values, and that's a behavioral interview based on the STAR model. But I guess it's all to say that really my idea with finding kind of talent that is, I guess, not obviously great on paper, which not how I want to put it. It's a poor way of putting it, but is really about like just interviewing people as if they're already working at Sift.
It's interesting that you have that mindset. One of the things that I always tell people, I've talked to a number of people about going into interviews and helping prepare for interviews, because I was, since I was in the military for the whole beginning part of my career, I'd never done an interview. And then I go out and I'm like, what am I doing? What is this whole thing? And then I got to be a hiring manager. And so one of the pieces of advice that I always give is that, look, no hiring manager, every hiring manager hates hiring. Like they're busy. They have things to do. They don't want to spend all day in interviews. They want to hire you. So just make it easy for them to hire you. And it's kind of almost sounds like you're kind of coming at that perspective from the interviewer of just like, no, we want to hire you. So just like help us hire you, kind of. Which is really interesting. I want to touch base on that. You met because you went over it really quickly. Some people might not be aware when you were talking about kind of the values interview, and you mentioned the STAR model. Could you touch on that just a little bit more?
Yeah. So this is something that I had learned at Riot, but it basically originated from Amazon, and it is situation, task, action, result. So the idea is that you ask a question. So in a behavioral interview, you're asking questions that should be solely based on previous experiences, right? So there are no hypothetical questions, because it's very easy to answer a hypothetical question about ideally what you would do, but really what you're looking for is like, what has the candidate done, right?
Yeah.
And then the STAR model is just a way of kind of how a candidate should break down their answer. And typically with a STAR model, you can have, a header question. So you can say like, tell me about a time where you had an interpersonal conflict with a peer. And then the situation would be this time that I was working with my peer on my project, and then the task, so on and so forth, right? So it's basically just a way of breaking down. And it's good both for structuring follow-up questions for interviewers, and I think it's really great for candidates as well, to think about, as they think about preparing for a behavioral interview, to kind of think about their answers in this model, because it's just much easier to kind of answer the question that way once you learn it.
Yeah, and it's nice because I think generally day to day, not many people are confronted with the kinds of questions that they would get in an interview. And so some people are good at interviews and some people aren't. And the more structure you can provide them for answering these kinds of questions, the more you are certain that you're truly testing them on how they're answering versus how they're able to interview, which is not a useful skill.
That's actually a really great point. Yeah, I really like that way, because you're basically evening the playing field a little bit and saying like, just answer this way, and then we're totally evaluating you based on what you've done, instead of like your ability to sell yourself or to interview.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that I wanted to bring up from the Lab Lab interview that I thought was really interesting was you talking about speed is the only unfair advantage, and this idea of shipping and iterating quickly. I get the opportunity in my role. I work with a lot of different companies, many of which are startups, many of which are more legacy aerospace companies. And I think a lot about, the ones that are really thriving in the world today and the ones that are struggling in the world today. And it all comes back to speed. It's just like comfortableness with rapid changes and kind of this idea that change isn't an event, it's the environment. Like it's just things are moving quickly and we got to be okay with that. How specifically you mentioned the quote was shipping and iterating quickly is a highly transferable skill. I rarely hear like speed as a skill, like talked about as a skill. What do you mean by that as being a skill?
It's really about pace of learning, right? And I think that's what my big takeaway from SpaceX was, that if like you learn quickly and then you can reincorporate those learnings and adapt and ship new things. So I'm thinking very much in the context of shipping software, but SpaceX, right? You look at how were they able to land a rocket? Well, there was a lot of failed rocket landings before that. and each rocket was slightly different because they kept testing new hardware designs and so on and so forth. And I think the same thing applies to building software. And it's actually easier when you're building software because you're changing bits, not atoms,
Yeah.
right? So you could ship something new, get feedback from customers, talk to customers, use the tool yourself, take those learnings, incorporate them, and then go back for more. I just returned from a conference in San Francisco this past week, and there was a lot of talk of agentic coding platforms and how a lot of software engineers are now leveraging multiple agents to work on multiple tasks at once. And I think that is also why speed, like that, that is almost, I'm not entirely sure if my mind is totally made up about it yet, but is it a threat to software engineering? I don't necessarily think so. I think the best software engineers are going to embrace that.
Yeah.
But that pace, like that enables such a quicker pace of innovation. It also means that the software that you've already built could probably be rebuilt in a matter of time by somebody else or your customer.
Yeah.
So you also, in that case, like speed is really the only moat, right? And speed also, I should say, manifests itself in insights, right? So how quickly, that goes back to learning, but like how quickly are you identifying a new problem to solve? And it's not only about like how quickly can you push a new feature.
So now that you're the CTO at Sift, how do you think about pushing your team towards speed? How do you incentivize speed? How do you keep them moving fast enough or faster?
This is a tough one, and this is one that I've thought about a lot. And I think that there's even some changes now that I've wanted to make to incentivize speed more. But I think one thing is really connecting engineers to the customer. I think a lot about motivation, and then like what motivates engineers. I also am leading our sales team right now, and our salespeople are very thoughtful, very intelligent, but the incentives are very clear, right? They close a deal,
yes,
they get commission for that deal.
That's the nice thing about sales.
Software, right? Nice thing about sales, exactly. And you can find levers to pull and to incentivize people to do different things. Essentially, software is a lot different because one, that's not traditionally how software engineers are compensated, but also I think people that tend to be software engineers are not motivated in that way. They're not thinking as much about like, of course, everyone wants to get paid and everyone should get compensated well, but also that they are more maybe interested in solving the problem, right?
Yes.
And digging into the technical details of how to solve that problem. So I think if I think back to when I write code and when I ship software, what was very gratifying for me was seeing how it impacted the customer and getting feedback from the customer. So then the way that I've thought about motivating the team is how do I bring the team closer to the customer so that when they make a change, they see the impact of their work. And it's pretty cool when we make a change and see the impact of our work because we're directly, helping people launch satellites and develop autonomous vehicles and launch rockets and so on and so forth, right? So like that's actually super gratifying. That's why a lot of people have chosen to come work at Sift is because they have that opportunity to make a difference in the physical world.
Yeah.
So it's really then about, I think bringing the engineers closer to the customer to kind of instill speed.
I love that. Very much a kind of a Travis Kalanick answer of a customer obsession. He's all about that, just like making sure people understand the pains of the customer and really going after solving those problems. Awesome. Well, what's next at Sift? Like, what is there a next big milestone? What are you working towards right now? What's the next big announcement going to be? Not that you can tell me like the next announcement, but what are you working towards right now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, for us right now, we've been growing our team. So we're at 70 people now. Nice. Our engineering team is about 40. I actually just hired a VP of engineering. He just signed with us. So he'll be starting in March.
Congrats.
Which I'm really excited about. I love being a leader, but as a founder, I think I've seen that I can provide value in a lot of different roles in this company. And I think we need, a VP of engineer who understands the next growth curve. We're going from probably 35-ish engineers to 50 or plus this year. And there's a lot of complexity in, managing a really functional organization of that size. Mm-hmm. So I'm really stoked that we've hired our VP of engineering. We've got, many kind of enterprise customers that we've been working with. So that's something that's very exciting. And then we're building new products. So we've got not only our core telemetry product, but we've been working on kind of new analysis products. to bring non-technical users into the platform, products for capturing data from different types of tests as well. That's not necessarily telemetry, but more measurement-oriented data. So yeah, lots cooking here at Sift.
So two things. One, the name suddenly hit me. So is it correct? Am I correct that it's sifting through the data to like find what you're looking for?
Exactly.
Of course. Yeah. I know why that took me so long. And then secondly, so you're going to be ingesting data from Artemis 2. Is that what I heard? Like you're going to be processing?
Correct. Yes.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yes. Yeah. So we've been working with them for a while now, and they're using us to review telemetry from the capsule.
That's exciting. Cool. Okay. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, Austin. Thank you so much. Really excited to have you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Matt. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening in on the conversation. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. If you are a manager yourself and you're looking for more insight onto how to better lead your team, please make sure to check out some of our other amazing episodes. If you are responsible for developing leaders in your organization and you're struggling to make programs that actually change behavior and actually impact the business, please reach out so we can figure out how to make your organization better every day. Drop me a line using matt@bettereverydaystudios.com. I look forward to the conversation.